I am a Democrat and very much interested in seeing how this conversation might regard the question of independent politics and independent candidacies as they start to mushroom around the country. A lot of the indications are in key states throughout the United States that the fastest growing segment of voters are not registered Democrats or registered Republicans, but registered independents. So here to talk to us about that, we have a roster of folks from the organization. They're going to be talking about why they think SAM represents a next step forward in this regard. And we're going to kick it off by introducing the chairman of SAM, someone who is also a former congressman in my neck of the woods here in the state of Florida, and also a cable television commentator on MSNBC, of course, former congressman and chairman of SAM, David Jolly. Good evening, Congressman Jolly.
Hey, good evening, Fernand, and thank you for doing this. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in tonight to learn a little bit more about SAM, but also for this conversation about independent parties and independent candidates. I know we have people joining us who are participants in other minor parties, not SAM. We have some people who are independents, Republicans, Democrats. Thank you for being here tonight. And Ferdinand, congratulations on your new role as an NBC contributor. And thank you for joining us tonight as a moderator, though not a member of SAM. We appreciate you lending your talents tonight.
It's my pleasure. And Congressman, if you don't mind, I'd like to just dive right in because you actually are one of the figures that over the last 4 years, you gained a tremendous national profile. You, of course, famously were a Republican member of Congress. You were willing to challenge your party when in Congress. Then you left the party and you had every opportunity to either join the Democratic Party, go back and try and reform the Republican Party from within, but you decided to actually stake out this role as a political independent. Why did you take that path and why did you do it with SAM?
Yeah. No, I love that, Ferdinand. And I got to tell you, one of the reasons I'm an independent is because I love independent politics. I'd been a Republican since I registered to vote at 18. And I suppose in retrospect, I was never quite a good enough Republican, by the dogma of the GOP. And if I were to join the Democratic Party, I would just become a part of a party that I wasn't a good enough Democrat at that point. Look, I left the party over the direction it was currently going, and I knew I would feel the relief of separating myself from the Republican Party. What I didn't realize was the freedom I would feel of being completely untethered to a political party and being able to really exercise the independent thought I had tried to bring to one of the two major parties, to the Republican Party. I think a lot of voters, probably people on the call tonight, have had a similar experience where maybe you've signed up for one of the two major parties based on a conviction you share on issues of healthcare or taxes or reproductive rights, regulation, whatever it might be. But in today's parties, if you sign up for one issue, you kind of have to sign up for all of them. And that doesn't really work for a lot of voters. So look, for people who are ardent members of the Democratic or Republican Party because those parties reflect your values, God bless you, that's fantastic. But we know by the numbers, somewhere between 30 and 40% of Americans today reject the two major parties. They want the independent movement, the independent party, if you will. I found my home in SAM as a way to participate in independent politics.
Congressman, again, there is no questioning the numbers. As you alluded to, there is a massive movement towards independent registrations all throughout all 50 states. But for a lot of us that are in the art of political consulting and work in those campaigns, when we think of independent candidacies, we think of one word, and that's spoilers. Candidates that end up running great races and fielding good candidates, but really tip the balance of the electoral side to one party or another. How would you and how does SAM plan to address that concern about really spoiler candidacies?
Yeah, I love that question because first, let me tell you what's different and new about the Serve America movement, the SAM party, compared to other independent parties or other minor parties. And then let's deconstruct the spoiler argument. The SAM party is unlike any political organization I've ever been a part of or I've ever seen. We are familiar with minor parties, the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, and so forth. Those alternative parties are still rooted in ideology, in dogma. What SAM has built is a coalition of former and current Republicans, Democrats, and independents. We're all over the map, where ideology is not the defining factor in our association. In fact, I call ourselves the true Big Tent party, progressives, conservatives, and Democrats. And instead of operating on this left-right ideological spectrum that we've come to intuitively default our politics to, we shift to a totally different spectrum and say, look, why don't we come together as a coalition around the shared values and shared principles of problem solving, of accountability, of democracy protection through electoral reforms, opening up primaries, creating more competitive electoral platforms, reforming gerrymandering, providing transparency to campaign finance. But at the end of the day, what we're acknowledging is for the hardest issues we face today, healthcare, immigration, taxes, whatever they might be, sometimes the answer is on the left, sometimes on the right, sometimes in the middle. Why should we shut ourselves out to solutions based on this left-right spectrum? And I think too often people conflate these problem-solving initiatives with being moderate in ideology. We don't do that at SAM. We don't try to push everybody's ideology somewhere into the center. We say, bring your ideology and let's figure out how these competing and contrasting ideologies can solve the problems. Very quickly, to deconstruct the spoiler argument. You are right that we often see an independent sometimes take from one party to the other, but not be viable in a general election. We want to test the theory of the case. If you go back to the 92 presidential race, where the moment met an independent candidate by the name of Ross Perot, people often forget Ross Perot led the presidential race in the summer of 1992 with 37% of the vote to 24 for the incumbent George Bush and 24 for Bill Clinton. He led the race. Now, he was an imperfect candidate who dropped out, and by the time he got back in, he still finished at 19%. A fifth of the nation still voted for him. We see once in a generation these disruptive opportunities for independent politics. I believe, and the folks at SAM believe, that if we can recruit viable independent candidates that can be seen as choices in equity on the ballot with a Republican and a Democratic nominee, that we know the independent voters are out there. When people register to vote, you choose R, D, or I, right? And those are essentially choices in equity when you're registering to vote. It's a generic choice. You're checking a box on a piece of paper, R, D, or I, and we roughly self-sort a third, a third, a third. But on the first Tuesday in November, we perform 50-50. Why is that? We believe, and in large part because of hurdles put up by the two major parties, that it is so difficult for a viable independent candidate to reach that first Tuesday in November that there aren't choices in equity. And that's why we see the 50-50 voting breakdown in November. At SAM, we're determined both to build a coalition around these shared values, but to identify, recruit, and run viable independent candidates that can compete with the two major parties.
Thank you so much for that, Congressman Jolly. And on that note, let's actually talk to someone who's run as an independent candidate before, and how that experience is now impacting the role that they're doing with SAM. Of course, I'm talking about the chairman of SAM in Connecticut, Monty Frank. Monty, welcome aboard. And can you tell us a little bit about what motivated you to run as an independent candidate in 2018 in the state of Connecticut, and how that led eventually to your involvement with SAM?
Happy to do that. And thank you for joining us. And thank you, Congressman, for your leadership. It's an interesting story. I mean, lifelong Democrat. I got a call on the way to the office one morning in 2000 and early 2018. And the call was something like, Oz Griebel is going to run for governor. And the campaign wants to talk to you about being his running mate. And, my jaw dropped to the floor. I knew Oz by reputation as being an extremely important person in the state, ran for governor as a Republican in 2010, did well, lost in the primary, a man of incredible integrity, knowledge of the state, deep rooted in policy. And I said, I'm a Democrat, right? And I believe in all these issues. And I went down the list of the red meat Democratic issues, and they're like, yeah, of course, we know all that stuff. That's why we want to talk to you. So I agreed to take the meeting. Oz and I had a long discussion, largely around policy. And we found that we had much more in common than you would expect from a lifelong Republican and a lifelong Democrat. We worked through all the issues. And then we started talking about principles of good governance, like governance. And this is how we would govern when we win. And what we found as we jumped into the campaign and actually were in Republican kitchens and Democratic kitchens is that people were more interested in fixing our broken state house and our broken democracy than they were in the actual ideological issues that the parties drive people towards to push them into corners to energize their bases. And so essentially, we were Sam before we knew about Sam, because we were having those discussions and having those meetings. And then we were thrilled that Sam endorsed us, and we started realizing that we weren't an island here in Connecticut, that there were people all over the country who shared our shared values around accountability and transparency and problem solving and electoral competition. And it was enlightening and liberating, as the congressman said. We did pretty well. We fought our way into all the debates. I think objectively, we won all the debates. We were endorsed by the Hartford Courant, which is the largest newspaper in the state. And then the parties really started to pay attention to us, started doing their negative ads, and our bottom dropped out. But we did well enough to have, if we had registered as a Sam party, emerge as a minor party. And we continue to work afterwards to make sure that what we started continues and that we could build a real coalition around good governance and change the face of the democratic process in Connecticut.
Monty, tell me briefly, before we move on, what would you say from your perspective are Sam's short-term major goals and long-term major goals?
Well, short term, we are building towards becoming a minor party and building our base. And we're doing that through energizing and reigniting the people who are involved in our campaign throughout the state. We have formed a Sam caucus in the legislature, which is essentially the problem solvers caucus around good governing principles. Our endorsed candidates are part of that caucus. We've got the deputy minority leader in the Senate as part of that caucus, and they're shoulder tapping their colleagues to say, hey, we're tired of this intractability in our state house. We want to solve the problems for the people, and they're bringing people in. We have municipal CEOs, our mayors, and our first selectmen around the state meeting along Sam principles. And what is so exciting about the caucus and the municipal leaders is it's Democrats, it's Republicans, it's people interested in possibly as running as a Sam candidate in 2021, and we're encouraging that. We're looking towards the 2022 election cycle to run a statewide candidate with the real probability of emerging out of that as a minor party, and then we'll start building towards major party status in 2026. But we're going to be a player from here on out to promote these. Again, not the left-right ideological issues. It's not a debate over whose dogma is better than the other party's dogma, but about ideas of good governance and trying to reform our democracy.
Thank you so much, Monty. And let's go from your home state of Connecticut to your neighboring state, the Empire State of New York to the north. With us now is the former Democratic mayor of Syracuse, New York, and 2018 Sam candidate for governor of New York, Stephanie Miner. Stephanie, good evening. Thanks for being here. And I'd love if you could please talk a little bit to us about how you first got involved with Sam and what was the experience being like running as a statewide candidate under the Sam banner, Stephanie?
Well, I think, Fernand, I want to first thank you and David for giving me, and I see that my Lieutenant Governor, Michael Volpe's on as well, the opportunity to speak about this. It really emanated from the fact that we were two mayors. And as mayors, every day you wake up and try to solve people's problems. And what Michael and I talked about was that it had become this point in the state where optics trumped substance and ideas no longer mattered. It was about whether you could spin something. And more running into people who just felt more and more disenfranchised by their government, felt like solutions weren't being offered, and that government was systematically adding obstacles to try to prevent having full discussion of ideas. And so the partisanship was really, if you are a one-party state, you end up denying people voices. And when you do that, you systematically end up denying ideas, and then you're not getting the best kind of solutions. And so New York is a very big state, and it was a great adventure because clearly the system did not want us to succeed in getting on the ballot. We were able to do that, and we got enough votes to establish ourselves, and then the system came back and said they didn't want to have that happen either. But the thing that was perhaps the most illuminating was everywhere we went and everyone we talked about a sense that our politics is broken, the civility is broken, and we want and desperately need to find a way to make ideas matter and to make civility matter and to focus on solving problems and how we can move forward together as a democracy, as opposed to how we can cut and slice everyone into separate corners.
Thank you so much for that, Stephanie. And of course, we know that based on what you all are trying to accomplish, from my understanding, it's not just a regional organization. You all have national aspirations. So when you think about states like New York and Connecticut in the overall SAM universe, I'd like to have the director of operations for the organization, Zach Colby, join us. And Zach, tell us a little bit about the history of SAM, and what would you say are the goals going forward as you begin to assert an identity for a lot of people that are just becoming familiar with it for the first time?
Yeah, SAM actually began in 2017 and was founded in the wake of the 2016 elections by basically a group of concerned citizens, Republicans, Democrats, and independents who are concerned about the direction of our country and concerned about the direction of our democracy. And obviously we've seen those fears play out in amazing and like unconscionable ways in the last 3 years that have made it now has never been a better time for SAM. And at the beginning, SAM, we didn't really know what we were going to be. And when we had this idea of a non-ideological new party, that was sort of the light bulb moment. And that was the moment where we've seen growth, and our trajectory has gone immediately upwards from there. So the goal moving forward is to become a major player and the new party in the United States. And we believe that the non-ideological approach that David mentioned earlier is the way to really do that. And David can add a little bit of color onto the non-ideological approach and why we think that that's a better approach than third parties or new parties have taken in the past.
Thanks for that, Zach. And let me go to Congressman Jolly on that. But first, think about it in these terms, Congressman Jolly. There were reports in the news today that there already is a faction of people that are registered as Republicans who are looking to form their own party in response to the Trumpist takeover of the old Republican Party. When you think about SAM, will it be almost, Congressman, like an amoeba that will absorb and try and absorb all of those other independent type mushroom groups out there? Or do you see the organization asserting itself as its own destination for independent candidate and politics?
Hey, David, you're muted.
I think the answer to the question depends on an individual's approach to politics. And obviously, I know a lot of the former Never Trumpers, as they're often labeled, and they're looking to start an alternative conservative party. And God bless them for doing that. I don't think that's the answer. I think there is a conservative party destination. It's the Republican Party, whether you accept the other values they currently represent or not. What is not out there is a platform that brings together competing ideologies. That's where SAM is unlike anything. Look, so the Republicans are trying to build a big tent around the people within their party. Democrats are trying to do the same. You know, after the House losses on November 3rd, we saw the Democratic caucus meeting where the AOC caucus and Abigail Spanberger and moderates had this fight over why'd they lose seats. The issue is not their individual ideologies. AOC was elevated by a progressive constituency, Spanberger by a moderate constituency, Matt Gaetz by a conservative constituency. The issue is we don't have a party today that provides a platform that welcomes all of those ideologies and a mechanism to figure out the right answers. Look, on policies, the issues we face today can be solved. In the healthcare debate, the issue with healthcare reform was certain people needed greater access, others needed greater affordability, and certain people lost out in that policy, right? Their prices went up or their policies got changed. They lost their doctors. Democrats were rewarded for speaking only to the first two constituencies. That's where their platform was. Republicans would only speak to the third because that's the only place they found votes. Neither party would speak to all three. That's the shortcoming of our two major parties, and it's something Sam is trying to do by the way we're constructing this Big Tent.
So, Congressman, I'm sure a lot of people are listening, nodding their heads and saying, all right, I like what I hear, but let's put some meat on that bone. Let's actually get down to brass tacks. When you think about a political precedent, Congressman, is there a model of success that Sam can look like in previous electoral contests in recent American political history and say that's the model, that's the type of approach that will be successful, that we think is the way forward for the future?
Yeah, great question, Ferdinand. Look, we're not naive. We realize this is a moonshot, right? This is going to take us years to do this, and so we're taking it on in a few ways. We're building infrastructure. There is no infrastructure really for the very broad independent movement that often brings together people of competing ideologies. There's just not the donor base organized around that and the infrastructure. So we have to build out the operations. That happens behind the curtain. What you're seeing on the streets is, as Monty was talking, a lot of local races, right? A lot of these politics get changed by focusing in on local city council mayoral races. But then we also need some high profile wins, right? We've got to run some statewide candidates, some federal candidates that are viable. And if you go back to that Perot analogy, it can be done, but we need the moment to meet us halfway. I think the 22 cycle is a cycle where the moment might meet independent politics halfway.
Well, you talk about the 22 cycle, and Congressman Jolly, you know me to be someone that's very direct, and I don't shy away from a difficult question. So speaking of recruiting some of those candidates, there's talk that there is a candidate that might be looking at the governor's race in the state of Florida, my home state, coincidentally your home state, and coincidentally that candidate is one David Jolly. So not to put you on the spot, Congressman, but are you going to be running as a Sam candidate for governor in Florida in 2022?
And look, there is a very good chance I will be a Sam candidate running for governor in the state of Florida in 2022. Yes. We are beginning to build out infrastructure and look at making a decision as a candidate, my wife and I, by the end of this calendar year. But alongside, Sam is building party infrastructure in the state of Florida. Whether David Jolly runs for governor, whether he runs for another office, or whether he doesn't run at all, the Sam party in Florida is coming, and we are building infrastructure. I will make an independent decision, my wife and I will, about whether or not we're going to be a candidate. But to your point on that question, Ferdinand, as we run local candidates, we're looking at very high profile candidates to run on the Sam ticket in Texas and Florida and Virginia, in New York and Connecticut, and in Iowa.
Just a quick follow-up, Congressman. A state like Florida, the current governor is seen by a lot of folks as basically a mini-me Donald Trump. And I think a lot of Democrats and independents who would like to see a change in government would say, I love David Jolly. Why can't he compete in a Democratic primary? Or worse, David Jolly's popular enough that he might just actually get enough votes to assure the reelection of a Ron DeSantis. How would you answer that question?
Yeah, look, I would say on behalf of 40% of Floridians who identify as independent voters, why should I be forced to associate with a major party just to be viable to serve the state in elected office? I think that's what we're trying to break, right? Now, let's hit the spoiler argument head on in the state of Florida for the governor's race. First of all, we know since January 6th, thousands upon thousands of Republicans are leaving the party and they're looking for a new home. Sam's a perfect home for those people. Democrats might also decide, I don't want to go the Andrew Gillum direction or the AOC direction. Perhaps I want more of a consensus, or perhaps I'm a progressive who just likes the Sam appeal. What I would say to my Republican friends is, if you think I'm a spoiler, then you shouldn't have a problem with it because your guy's the incumbent. And to my Democratic friends who say I'm a spoiler, I would say to my Democratic friends in Florida, you haven't won the governor's mansion in 28 years. So if you want to come in second again, I suppose I might be a spoiler to a runner-up race, but I don't believe the Florida Democratic Party is in the place to change direction in Tallahassee. Perhaps what we need to do is create a coalition between independents, progressives, and some conservatives to finally change direction in Tallahassee.
I think you just made some news, as they say, on this Sam webinar, Congressman Jolly. Let's actually move over for a second, if you don't mind, to the more personal side of Sam. And joining us now is Vicky Fennel. Vicky, you've been involved for quite a number of time with Sam, and I'd just like to learn a little bit about why you first got involved and how specifically you think it could help community and community groups.
Vicky, I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me? Can you see me?
There you go, loud and clear, Vicky. Welcome aboard.
Okay, thank you. Like you, I am a Democrat, lifelong Democrat. I really don't like the direction of the party, locally and nationally. And so I worked as a volunteer on the 2018 campaign with for Oz Griebel and Monty Frank. So like Monty said, we were Sam before Sam. And I knew Oz, I knew what he stood for, his expertise, his knowledge. Monty certainly added something, brought something different to the ticket, something also very good. And I liked the way they approached the issues. They were not afraid to go anywhere. They were speaking to voters in a respectful way. They were being realistic, and they were offering solutions to the problems, you know, that faced the state in Connecticut. I like the fact that they were inclusive across the board, and they acknowledged and they offered solutions to problems that were facing not only the inner cities, but also the suburbs. And one thing, you know, I think voters, they don't like to see their political figures get caught up in personalities. And in this campaign, they did not get caught up in the personalities, but they rolled up their sleeves. They got in, it was the policies that mattered, and wanted to go to work on behalf for the people of Connecticut. And I think as voters, you know, I know this, I can speak for myself, I'm looking for results. I'm not looking for the same old, which is what the major parties are offering. You look at the conditions of the inner cities, what has changed? Nothing. The neighborhoods look the same, the blight, crime, the policies are clearly not working for the people. You have politicians that are more concerned about how they look on the evening news. They're really not policy or result oriented, but more career oriented, more like what's my next move. And I think a lot of times the voters are left out of the equation. There's even a hostility towards change or a new way of thinking, approaches. So in the end, I think the voter is the loser. And I also think the time has come for real change. I think we all know the system is broken, but we just can't sit on the sidelines and you know, be angry and then think it can't be fixed. So I think we the people require, we are the people, and it requires new thinking, independent thinking, because you can't be swayed by, you know, party politics. It's about organizing, it's about mobilizing, and I also think it's about major education, and particularly in the community, in our inner cities, where there's been unfortunately, sort of like a brainwashing has taken place. So I think overall, I think people want to see their representatives work together, and you know, that's where we're at right now.
Thank you so much, Vicky. Vicky, I'd like to switch our attention back to the New York experience, because we have actually with us now the chairman of the New York chapter of SAM, someone who's actually done the full 360, and it's, of course, Michael Volpe. Michael, welcome aboard, and tell us a little bit, Michael, about your initial involvement. And as someone who has done the whole merry-go-round, you started off as a Democrat, then you became a Republican, then an independent. Tell us a little bit about your experience with SAM and what's going forward there in New York.
My experience at SAM has been very positive. I got involved in SAM after attending a lecture by David Brooks. After the 2016 election, I felt that both parties were just heading in directions that were not responsive to the needs of citizens and voters, as Vicky just said. You said I did the complete 360. I can assure the listeners here tonight, I'm never going back to the D's or the R's. They're both irreparably broken. And what's going on in SAM, New York, there's been a lot of chatter on the chat room here about building locally, and that's exactly what we've done since we achieved ballot status in 2018. In 2019, we ran 100 candidates, mostly fusion candidates. We prevailed, or they prevailed in about 54, 55 races. In 2020, we had over 40 candidates, about 22 prevailed in their races, and we've made a difference. And the most important thing that I'm proud of is that we're actually trying to build from the local up and listen to people and listen to their needs. And when you do, you find out that the educational system is broken. Public education needs to be fixed. You find out there's not enough economic opportunity for people in any state, and in New York State, with all its resources, it's still lacking. You find out that people are very concerned about the direction of New York State, and they're leaving in record numbers. The best real estate broker for Florida is Andrew Cuomo. Maybe the best is Bill de Blasio. The second best is Andrew Cuomo. And the end result is that states like ours are suffering. So we need change. We need real change. And as Stephanie said, without listening to the issues that are presented to everyday people and really trying to solve their problems with science and facts, you don't get to the core of the problem.
Michael,
That's
it
what we're
seems
working
that it seems like you've caught the attention of Governor Cuomo and others. There's some court litigation there to deal with the very question of minor parties in New York State. How is that impacting what Sam is trying to do going forward and now in the 2021 New York City races?
Well, it's impacting very much so. The governor and his colleagues up in Albany put into the budget a year and a half ago a new law that changed the ballot status requirements. We challenged that in federal court, and while we've lost that court case, we're still going to participate in all of the elections if we have candidates who are worthy of our brand and worthy of our principles and abide by our principles and beliefs. And we're more than willing to run a candidate for the mayor of New York, the city council races. There's 30 some odd up for grabs this year. And across the state, there are other races that are very important. But what's critical to the listeners is you have to build this locally. David has said this many times. You can't just start from a top-down approach across the entire country. You have to build it locally. You have to get the support, have the infrastructure, and then years down the road, we'll be prepared to make a difference in the presidential race.
Thank you so much, Michael. And as Sam looks towards the future, what are they thinking about in terms of organizing new states? Here to answer that question is the National Outreach Director for the organization, Alex Hackworth. Alex, tell us a little bit about Sam's plans for organizing in this year of 2021 and beyond into the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, David, and thank you, Fernand. I'm excited to be here. I'm calling in from the great state of Missouri, and I love seeing where everyone else is calling in from as well. You know, I've been really inspired with all the conversations that I've been having over the last month. If there's a few things that stand out to me, it's that people are worried about the direction that their parties are moving, and they are tired and fed up with the direction that our politics are headed towards in a general sense. And like Americans always do, they are ready to roll their sleeves up and get organized in their community and start making a difference where it matters most. And for me, that's the most important part, is making sure that this movement is community driven, because let's face it, the issues that we see in St. Louis, Missouri might be a little different than the issues we see in New York City, New York. And so that's why over the last month, we've been going into states all across the country, 25 of them, all the way from California to Maine, Florida to Washington, and having conversations with folks who are ready to get to work and make that difference in their community. You know, if any of this about Sam speaks to you, reach out to me. My email's in the chat. I'll keep shooting it out there. And then you'll hear from me very shortly after this with an email. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Alex. Now let's turn to one of the supporters, the folks that make Sam go. It's Carl McCluster, who's a pastor in the state of Connecticut. Carl, why did you decide it was time to get involved with Sam after observing politics for as many years as you have in the state of Connecticut?
Carl, you're on mute.
Went small for a second. Listen, when I came out of high school and went to college at Colorado College, Colorado, I was a Republican because I didn't know anything. The people there were Republicans, so I got involved with them. When I came to Connecticut to go to school at Yale, then I saw that the majority of people were Democrats, and so I sort of hung out with them. I got tired of being left out, not being able to have a say in it. But what I found two things about both those parties in both those places and globally, and that is that if you don't get in line, if you don't have a herd mentality and run with the crowd, then your thoughts are minimized. You're not considered. You're not listened to. And we need a place where new ideas and fresh ideas can come up. Montague was not wrong when he said, except for in some rare cases, that the best don't come to politics. It's because we're muted. We need to begin to listen to ideas. SAM is a place where we can talk about ways to get people involved. In Connecticut, 42% of us are unaffiliated voters. That means that we have the majority more than the Republicans or the Democrats. We just need to express ourselves. But unless we get in line with one of the parties, then that's muted. That's what SAM is for. SAM is for a place for new ideas, for fresh leaders, for ideas instead of just politics. That's why ranked choice voting, that's why open primaries are so critical, because they give people a voice. And that's what SAM means to me. I'm still an independent. I'm going to be an independent, but I'm going to support SAM because it is a fresh voice in the midst of all of this, what we've seen. We've seen what the divisive politics have done to the country and have done to each of our states. And it's time for us to say no more. It's time for ideals to rule and not parties to rule. And that's what SAM represents to me.
Thank you so much, Carl. And I know that so many of you are watching and waiting so patiently. You have a bunch of questions. We're about to get to the Q&A section. But before I do that, I want to bring back Congressman Jolly, who, as I mentioned at the outset, is the chairman of SAM, just to make some concluding remarks before we turn it over to all of you with your questions. Congressman?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for everybody who's on the call, and for our participants from SAM tonight, Ferdinand, to you. Look, SAM is building from the grassroots. We are building locally. And as Alex, I believe, said, issues are often different from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the Midwest to the Southwest. And so what we are building out is a coalition, a national coalition around the shared principles we've discussed that reflects the ideology and principles of your own community. And we have found that one of the go-to places is in this space of electoral reform. You know, the best way to protect democracy is to ensure equal access to the ballot box for both voters and for candidates. So a lot of our coalitions are participating in initiatives around what Carl mentioned, ranked choice voting or open primary or gerrymandering reform, whatever it might be. So if that is an issue in your community or state, we want to talk to you. We want to work with you. If there are independent candidates that are really looking for a foothold, we want to talk to you. And if you just want to mobilize a SAM chapter in your area, we want to talk to you. Go to our website, joinsam.org, get in touch with Alex, whose email is here. You're going to hear from Alex as well. Look, this is on us to make it happen. We know the data is there. We believe this is the moment for a viable new party to emerge and provide a home for people that don't find one in the current landscape of today's politics.
Thank you for that, Congressman Jolly. And now I think there's a lot of questions. So why don't we try and get to as many as we can in our remaining minutes here.
Yeah, one that often crops up in the SAM universe, and I saw Jared Patton just ask, I think this would be a good one for David, is what do you tell people when you're trying to spread the word about SAM when they ask, what is Sam's stance on guns, or what is Sam's stance on abortion? What is Sam's stance on the issue that I care about most?
Yeah. So look, I love that question because I think it's important. You know, when we initially rolled out SAM as kind of rejecting the left-right axis, we had to live with it for a little bit before we realized what we're really saying is all are welcome, right? Progressives, conservatives, moderates. It's what we're rejecting is the dogma of either being absolutely left, absolutely right, or absolutely center. So what SAM does is it recognizes that the politics in your community around a tough issue like guns or healthcare or immigration might be different than the politics in a different area. Right? That's the whole fight between AOC and Spanberger within the Democratic caucus. Their communities are different. And so what Sam says is, if you're left, right, or middle, bring those ideologies, and then let's come together around the shared value of problem solving. I think we could create a majority party for a generation to come if we're the party that says, look, greater gun control can protect innocent lives from violence, but also protect the ability of rightful owners to own a firearm. On immigration, we can recognize the value of every human life and create a pathway towards citizenship while also providing for border security. On healthcare, we can expand access and affordability while also protecting a robust private market. Those are all competing ideologies in today's marketplace of ideas that you look at on Capitol Hill. At SAM, we're saying those are all within our tent.
Zach, what else do we have teed up in terms of questions? And by the way, folks, you can send questions through the chat option directly or raise your hand, and Zach will try and acknowledge you and filter those to me and the other panelists here on board.
Yep, here's one from Sandy Parker. She says, the obvious question is, won't a third party candidate just split off votes from the two major party candidates to the benefit of one of them? Remember Ross Perot, or recently legislative races in Florida?
Yeah, hey, look, in the interest of time, let me just revisit that. I think I've made the case that Ross Perot actually was leading in the summer of 92 by 13 points. As that race evolved, he just proved to not be the candidate for the moment, but the moment was there for independent politics. But more importantly, I would also say at the local level, you don't see that spoiler effect. At the local level, the candidates appear in equity far more than at the national level. And that's where Sam is really focused in New York and Connecticut and other states. It's at the local races where we're really seeing the success of independent candidates.
And here's a good follow-up to that from Andrea Samuels. Local elections are the foundation for any party obtaining a foothold. They also tend to be nonpartisan. My experience has shown me that the Republican Party, there are no nonpartisan races. How will Sam develop a platform of support for local elections, and what would that support look like?
Hey, Monty, you want to talk about what you're doing in Connecticut around local races?
Yeah, we're building it, and we're supporting candidates. And for us, it doesn't matter whether you're running as a Democrat or a Republican, or if you want to petition on as a Sam candidate. If you're willing to stand up and pledge to the Sam values of accountability, transparency, problem solving, and electoral competition, we'll support you. And what we're finding is that there's a tremendous amount of traction in local elections, particularly as things become more divisive on the statewide level and at the national level. That people on the local level are petrified that what they're seeing in government, the state, and at the national level will filter down to the local municipalities. And if the local municipalities end up in gridlock the way our state and national governments are, then we've got complete paralysis up and down the line. So there are a lot of people who are getting energized. They're standing up. They're supporting SAM principles. And we're going to see, hopefully, in the next election, if we're successful, candidates running as SAM, Democrats, Republicans, but based on SAM principles, which will then filter up to the state and then hopefully to the national level. So
Can I just say that I have to agree with Monty. The reason that Monty and Oz were so well received in Connecticut is because they had the ability to make it local. All politics are local, right? We only care what happens in our backyard first and last and in the middle. And so I think that Monty hit it on the head. You have the ability to really have conversation, not on the two extremes, but right where you are in the middle. Where you are is in the middle. Where you live is in the middle. What happens in your neighborhood is in the middle. And that's what Sam represents to me. People who are really bringing ideas to the table and not bringing a banner from whatever national party it is that comes in and says, this is the way it has to be done in order to be successful here.
Awesome. Thanks, Monty and Carl. This question has popped up in the chat many times, and it is, how can we, SAM supporters, get more involved? What can we do? What are the tangible actions we can take?
Yeah, so let me take that one. Alex, you might have a comment as well. We are experiencing incredible growth at SAM and incredible momentum, right? We are 3 or 4 years into this, but honestly, since the events of January 6th, our traffic, our membership, the interest level is up over 2,000% year over year and month over month. And then through the inauguration and now where we are today, we are seeing an enormous interest. And so we're getting our hands around it. Alex's job, Alex is the point person to make sure all of our regional and local interested SAM members are touched and they have somebody to reach out to and have a personal relationship in our office. As I mentioned, for some, it's building a community coalition around perhaps a county commission issue or a city council race or a mayoral race. In others, as I mentioned, in Texas and the state of Florida, we're actively building out a party. And so that comes with different infrastructure demands. But the pipeline is to push everything through Alex, let him know of your interests, and allow Alex to connect the dots within your region and state.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, David. And just to touch on that again, you can feel free to email me at ahackworth@joinsam.org. I'll put it back in the chat, and be on the lookout for that email after this. But if you want to do something right now, what you can do is go follow and like us on our social media accounts. Start talking about this with your family, and start sharing the vision for what American politics looks like when Sam is successful.
Great. Thank you, David and Alex. The next is a question from Dina Slaff. Is there a strategy for Sam to collaborate with or join forces with the existing parties to pass electoral reform, which will then better facilitate their participation in the political system?
Look, I think there are similar organizations to ours working on similar issues. And in certain states, that includes the major parties. Sam endorsed Alaska's top 4 primary, as well as their campaign finance reform initiatives. Sam endorsed open primaries in the state of Florida. We endorsed ranked choice voting in Maine. So Sam works alongside any organization that shares our priorities in that area. And that can be a common place to work with. I want to grab one issue that just came through the chat room, because Zach, I don't know if you're going to ask it, and it's an important one. It said, are you saying you'll endorse absolutely anybody that it signs up for Sam's core principles, regardless of platform? Without answering a hard yes or no, what I would say is we operate like a national party. And so while there's a Sam national party, there are state parties as well. And what happened in Connecticut this cycle is they had a questionnaire for potential candidates that was filled out, and the Sam and Connecticut Endorsement Committee reviewed that, held interviews, and based on those interviews and the values expressed by the candidates, Sam Connecticut determined whether or not to endorse a candidate. So it is not simply a check these boxes and you get the endorsement. There is a process through which candidates are vetted, and that happens at the state committee level.
Can I follow up on that for 1 second, David?
You bet.
And that is critical, because when we did the interviews in Connecticut of people running for legislature or the state Senate, and we'll do it again in the municipal elections, we focused on problem solving in addition to the other pillars. But problem solving, that one principle kind of fleshes out the pure ideologues. So you don't run into that problem, because if you're not willing to have a conversation around a particular issue and demonstrate your ability to solve the problems, then we're not going to endorse you. Because if you're going to just carry that ideology and that dogma to the state house, you're just going to be part of the problem instead of part of the solution, and then you're not for us.
And in New York, Monty, to your point, we interviewed in 2019 over 200 candidates who wanted our ballot line, and actually rejected more people than those we put on the ballot line. So to your very good point, if a particular issue was discussed and you couldn't work through the problem-solving equation because of an ideological position you were taking, you were not offered the ballot line.
Very good.
That's building locally. That's saying to the local citizen, this candidate will or will not attempt to solve your problem with education, crime, infrastructure problems, economic opportunity and new jobs, whatever it may be. And if you're going to be completely ideological about it, you're not for Sam.
And let's stay in New York for a little bit. I just saw a New York question come through, Michael. What is being done to ensure that Sam New York can continue to be an effective player in New York State, given the recent increase in requirements for gaining ballot access?
Well, the Democratic controlled the governor's house and the legislative body have made it very difficult. Someone asked if we could work with the other parties to sort of solve the problem and have minor parties to have a bigger voice, is basically the question. The answer there in New York is no. I think there are moves underfoot to cut down on the number of options. Right now, there'll only be 4 parties: the Democrats, Republicans, conservatives aligned with the Republicans, and working families aligned with the Democrats. So there's really 2 choices to the citizens, which is terrible for democracy. The founders of the Constitution warned against this very problem. So what we're trying to do, though, to the folks that have made the comments about all politics are local, we'll support candidates locally. We can get them on the ballot through what's called an independent petitioning process, and we can advocate for the principles we've talked about tonight And I guarantee you we can make a difference in local races and work our way up, as David said, to the bigger races.
Excellent. Thank you. Here's another great question that just came in through the chat, and David touched on this a little bit earlier, but some people say that America's political system is hopelessly broken, that we should just leave because the two-party system is too entrenched. The system makes it actively difficult to go against it. So what makes you think that you have any chance of succeeding? What do you say to those people?
I love that question, because I would flip the script and say, what's the alternative? To give up? I don't think any of us are willing to give up. There's too much important to fight for. And the challenges are great. Part of this conversation around electoral reform is because the major parties have made it so difficult for independent voters and new parties to coalesce and emerge and be viable. Every state is a little different. Without going too deep into it, we often conflate in political conversations the issue of ballot access and the issue of party formation. Those are two different concepts, and they are different in all 50 states. So building this out is hard work. And I would say, as somebody who tried to quit politics 3 times, I'm not giving up. And I think the people on this call tonight aren't giving up either. There's a reason you're giving an hour of your time tonight for a Zoom call with people you've never met. It's because you believe in the country as much as we do. And we've got an opportunity to change politics. And the reason I say God bless the two major parties is, I mean it. There's a place for them. They are the home of rigid ideology that reflects the hardened ideology of a lot of Americans who think that ideology is the most important thing in politics. So that's fine. That's a home for them. But this isn't about David Jolly and Monty Frank and Carl and Michael and Alex and Vicky and everybody else. This is about 40% of the country who says, I can't find my home in the two major parties, so what do I do? And if the two major parties have made it too hard for them to participate, well, that's all the more reason that those of us on the call tonight should be fighting to change this and change it for good.
Zach, let's see. Do we have time for one more question maybe before we bring this in for a landing?
Let's do it. And I won't ask you guys the question about the Jolly Amandi ticket that we keep seeing pop up in the chat.
Hey, no, it's got to be Amandi Jolly. If we do this, Amandi's on the top of the ticket.
Gene Miles says, without ranked choice voting or open primaries, can Sam get the financial backing we need to be successful in big races? Which happens first?
That's a fantastic question. So it all has to happen at the same time. But the reason it's a fantastic question is, one, we're working on the electoral reform initiatives. The Connecticut State Committee is working on them. They're a priority of New York. They're a priority of each of our task forces out there. We are working daily on electoral reform initiatives. But you also asked about financing. We need resources. Fortunately for Sam, we have had some very generous donors over the years that have kept Sam's infrastructure going and our operations going. But like any political organization, we need financial support. And so we need the small dollar donors even more than we need the large dollar donors, because we need people bought into this movement. So Gene, I'm going to flip the script on you and say, would you give us $5 to help us keep going? And everybody on this call, you're going to get emails. If this is something you believe in, like these are unusual economic times. We're not asking you to do something that puts you in an uncomfortable spot. But if you've got a dime to spare to try to change politics, consider financially supporting Sam. We'd certainly appreciate it. And we'd like to work with you on changing politics.
Well, thank you all for your questions, for your participations. I want to give a special shout out, of course, to everybody from SAM that participated tonight. Monty Frank, Stephanie Miner, Zach Colby, Vicky Fennel, Michael Volpe, Alex Hackworth, Carl McCluster. And I want to give the last word to the chairman of SAM, and it looks like maybe candidate for Florida governor, Congressman David Jolly, after he made news. I wasn't expecting you to make news like that tonight.
You're running mate. You're running mate.
Fernand, run to Twitter right now. Look, the first thing I want to do in closing remarks is thank Fernand. I appreciate you as a Democrat participating in this very important conversation. I know a lot of people within the two major parties are a little iffy around independent politics, but I'll tell you, it's a testament to Fernand's commitment to just getting things right in the body politic and in the country. You're a friend. You're a fantastic contributor on NBC. Thank you for that tonight, for being a part of this. Do email Alex. Do go to our website, joinsam.org. Check us out on social media. respond to our emails when we reach out to you tonight or tomorrow. Let us know where you're at and how you might want to get involved. And also look out for a couple products. We have Sam Studio, which is online, samstudio.org. We're always updating content regarding democracy reform and new parties. We have a podcast that generally comes out once a week. Tomorrow, Friday morning, this Zoom call will have been recorded and distributed. And then we're going to try to do these national Zoom calls more regularly. And we'll have other guests. We'll have leading academics on what it means for new parties to create viability. We'll have perhaps other political parties, minor parties, other candidates, but we want to keep this movement going. And the only way it keeps going is with your participation. So Fernand, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to every guest tonight. Thank you. Check us out at joinsam.org and let's change politics.